Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Habitronistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing so that we can bring you behind the headlines what is really happening here in Israel. It's a great honor to be joined today by Eli Pieps, who is the Director of International Affairs for IDSF. And if there's any activities that we are doing abroad with foreign governments in the US to educate about what is happening in Israel, that is Eli's expertise. So Eli, thank you so much for joining.
Moshe, it's a pleasure to be with you and a pleasure to be talking to all of our listeners.
So why don't we start off, Eli, the floor is yours. What can you update us in terms of the developing US-Israel relationship over the course of this war?
Thank you, Moshe. Israel's learned a lot since October 7th when it comes to the US-Israel relationship. And unfortunately, what we saw last week, at the end of last week, with Senator Schumer, who is not only is he the majority leader, meaning he's the most senior and the leader of the U.S. Senate, but he's also the most high-profile American Jew ever. So he has a lot of influence on every issue, but particularly when it comes to issues dealing with Israel. And unfortunately, last week, Senator Schumer thought it was the right thing to do to speak on the floor of the U.S. Senate and really hammer and criticize Israel in a very direct way, frankly, fairly unprecedented, not just for America's relationship with Israel, but I would even argue for America's relationship with almost any ally. To see the majority leader of the Senate criticize an ally so directly was very upsetting, and particularly some of his requests, some of his demands that Israel should go to elections and that the Israeli Prime Minister is a threat to Israel's safety and peace was actually quite somewhat outrageous and really, to use a term that Senator Schumer uses often, a chutzpah. And I think that's something that is of great concern. And what it demonstrates that there is real friction that's developing between America and Israel, and certainly this administration. To a certain extent, the friction had been limited to the Biden administration to a certain extent with our government, but now it's moved and traveled down to the U.S. Senate. That's a bigger issue. Now, I do want to suggest, and I do want to say that is an argument that Senator Schumer was actually protecting Israel in a certain way. Now, how was he protecting Israel? Because he was under tremendous pressure to actually call directly for an immediate ceasefire, which would have been something that Israel would certainly not have appreciated and would have applied actual pressure on Israel. Right now, this kind of criticism was obviously just very upsetting, but doesn't apply any kind of real pressure. The majority leader, Senator Schumer, saying that Bibi is an obstacle to peace and he should go to elections is not going to actually move the prime minister towards new elections. However, if he were to speak something in the nature of that, it has come to our conclusion that Israel needs to go ahead and create and enter into a long-term ceasefire, that would definitely lead to much stronger international pressure that may be more difficult for Israel to respond to. So the argument is made that he went ahead and attacked the prime minister personally, which was really red meat for a progressive base amongst the Democratic Party, who really see the prime minister as persona non grata, but refrained from actually going ahead and calling for anything concrete for the state of Israel to do. Regardless, either way, this still was, I would say, an escalation in the level of friction between our two governments, which by itself is a problem. Before October 7th, General Avivi and others in our organization have been speaking, certainly in the Knesset, but also around the world. And I was with General Avivi in DC a number of times, where he had said that one of the things that is going to cause Israel to be at an actual state of war in the coming 6 months to 24 months, he was off by about 1 month, was that the sense of daylight between America and Israel. Why? Because if there is a sense of daylight, if we aren't in sync, if Israel and the US are not in sync, that is a very strong message to Israel's enemies that this is probably a good time to attack. And what we had seen in the lead up to October 7th is that Arab media was talking extensively about how, if you remember, the country was really divided. There was a lot of friction internally. We had some irresponsible officers, Air Force officers primarily, were saying they weren't going to serve. This was something that you heard in Arab media. This was not from from secret or sensitive or confidential information. This is something that was broadly broadcast in Arab media. And you see the combination of that sense within Arab media that the country of Israel may not actually respond. There may be some of its senior officers may not participate in supporting its government. And then you have on top of that, Israel's strongest ally may not support Israel completely. You put all that together, Israel seems about as vulnerable as ever. And one of the things you always want to avoid is if you want to protect our country, you want to make sure that our deterrence is intact. And those two factors very clearly eroded our deterrence. And as we are now 5 months into a war, to make it clear to both our enemies and our allies that our relationship with the US is not good, is problematic. From a straight security perspective, it's not a partisan issue, but it's from a straight security perspective, it is problematic. Now, when we look at what we expect to be happening, practically, I would anticipate that both the administration, not so much Senator Schumer, I don't know how much he will continue on this path, because I do think that he is getting some significant pushback, certainly from the American Jewish community on that, on his statements. But I think that for both Biden and for Prime Minister Netanyahu, to the extent that it's not pleasant for us to see them beating up each other, to a certain extent, it actually benefits one another politically. President Biden is getting a lot of flack from his left base that he has been too supportive of Israel. He has refused to restrain Israel whatsoever, and that Prime Minister Netanyahu walks all over him. And this is his opportunity to be a tough guy, to push back on the Prime Minister, and to publicly shame both the Prime Minister, shame Israel by referring to violent settlers and things of that sort, and sanctioning them, and giving a little bit of red meat to his base. And at the same time, it also benefits Prime Minister Netanyahu because Prime Minister Netanyahu, while he has a strong, a relatively strong coalition, it's a war. There was obviously a lot of friction before the war began, but when his base sees that you have the U.S., our strongest ally, pushing back against us, pressuring Israel at this moment to recognize a Palestinian state, to accept that Hamas cannot be defeated and that Hamas should be part of the ruling entity in Gaza, that very much unifies and strengthens the Prime Minister's base. And as a result, he benefits every single time Biden threatens Israel, because he knows how to fight back against that. And it's so outrageous, the kind of accusations that from the Israeli public's perspective, that Biden is doing that, and therefore that strengthens Bibi. So both political leaders benefit from this public jabbing and jarring at each other. Unfortunately, the result is that there is damage done to Israel's deterrence, which during a war is really quite damaging. I guess you could ask a question, how do we resolve this? I'll say whenever you have a fire, there's really two ways you can put a fire out if you speak to firefighters. One is, a very basic thing. You have fire, you put out water, and you try to extinguish the fire. But the other option, and sometimes you'll see this in wildfires, that the fire department will allow a fire to burn out all of the fuel, and just to let it burn out. And again, an argument can be made that if Senator Schumer, as he used in his speech in the Senate, that he says his name Schumer comes from the name Shomer, meaning he's a protector. He sees himself as a protector of Israel. If you take him at his word, and again, IDSF is not an organization that gets involved in partisan politics in Israel or in the U.S. So I want to make that very clear. And there is tremendous value in there being a strong bipartisan support for Israel, but it cannot be at the expense of diluting what it means to be pro-Israel. I think that those are two important points. So, with bearing that in mind, one of the arguments made is that the climate in the Democratic, in the progressive base, in the far left base, and now moving into the more moderate base even of the Democrats, is so extreme and is so anti-Israel that you just got to let it burn out. You just got to give it let it burn itself out now, and then it can move on. It's becoming quite clear that actually one of the biggest driving forces amongst progressive politics right now is not the traditional issues that have really charged them in the past, issues like climate change, issues like choice and women's rights. That's no longer, at least right now, that is not the emotionally driving force. It is this war with Israel. The Hamas-Israel war is presented as Israel is a strong entity. It's taking advantage of a weaker, despite October 7th. The narrative is that Israel is taking advantage and harming a weaker opponent, and that's based on years and years and years of allowing BDS, the delegitimization of Israel, to take root amongst the progressives. And I think that is something that needs to be said, that right now it is very difficult for pro-Israel Democrats to be able to express support for Israel. The reason why it's difficult is because they have tolerated and allowed BDS to stay and to build a certain amount of traction. And at this point, you combine that about a decade or so of BDS being accepted, combine that with October 7th, all of a sudden, we now have a fire that's out of control and very difficult to burn. To that extent, I think it's important to acknowledge that right now, actually, General Avivi is in the States. He will actually be spending a day in DC tomorrow. Well, he will be meeting with Republicans and Democrats. He'll have a meeting with the State Department. Our message is clear, and our message is critical, and it's important for our friends in the States to understand, particularly those pro-Israel Democrats who want to be supporting Israel, but to feel that they don't really have the opportunity to do so right now. They need to understand what the plan for the war is, that it's going to be a long war, why Israel is doing what it's doing. And obviously, again, we don't speak for the government itself, but when they hear General Avivi, they hear someone who comes with a tremendous amount of credibility on Capitol Hill, and someone that they take quite seriously. Also, before we go to questions, Moshe, one other thing worth pointing out, Ori Sachar, who I know has been a speaker on these broadcasts many times, he's right now in Brussels at the European Parliament. He'll be there for a couple of days having similar meetings with a broad range of elected officials there. They go to elections in June, and the issue of Israel there, obviously things are quite different. In Europe, there is a tremendous motivation and there's tremendous momentum to call for what we call a premature ceasefire, and they need our messaging right now to understand why that's so damaging, why recognizing a Palestinian state would be devastating not just to Israel, but frankly to the West. It will be making it very clear to Iran and others that you can do on October 7th and then eventually achieve your political goals. And that is a terrible message for Iran, and from other bad actors, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, to learn. And frankly, that is the message that they will learn. If more countries move along towards pressuring Israel towards the establishment or towards recognizing a Palestinian state at this point. Moshe, any questions that you want us to address?
Ellie, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Your comparison to the firefighters is very helpful and instructive, but I guess I would ask, does Israel have the luxury of waiting it out, waiting for the fuel to burn up? Meaning, since October 7th, we've only seen an increase in the strength of anti-Semitism and attacking Israel in the media. So right now, Israel needs to press forward in Gaza, complete the operations. To wait for the fuel of anti-Semitism to burn out, that could be quite literally many years.
You're right. And I think what I would say is that I think with the fuel, I don't think there's no sense that Israel is going to be waiting for the fuel of anti-Semitism to burn out. The only potential of that is that as high-profile Democrats are trying to push this issue right now into the forefront, and trying to get some of the progressives energized, their hope is that people will lose focus and on this issue, because actually it doesn't actually affect the day-to-day life of Americans very much, and that as the U.S. election cycle moves more and more towards ahead, moves towards usually the beginning of the real election campaign is usually Labor Day, so September, October, the first week of November, that by that point this issue will kind of a little bit be behind us. They've gotten all they can out of it, and then they'll revert back to their typical issues that have energized that base. So we'll be less focused on Israel, more focused on climate and the other issues that really animate and excite the progressive left. But you're right, it remains a problem. But I'll say there actually is one, I would say, one real benefit towards this posture of the Biden administration, and now even with Senator Schumer. And that is, I remember I was actually in Budapest the first week after October 7th. I was supposed to travel actually with Ari Singer, who I know, who has a General Ari Singer, who has been on this broadcast as well a number of times. He obviously was not able to travel as October 7th has happened, had just happened. But I remember at that point, as we were still just really learning exactly what had happened, or starting to take that into account and really appreciate what had happened and how Israel was going to be transformed. And we knew Israel was going to be facing a very long war and a really long reckoning and a change of attitude. What we also understood was that, and my hope was that Israel would teach Iran and our enemies one very important lesson. And that is, we knew at that point that I was talking in Europe, that many European countries were giving us a very strong hug. But we also knew that that hug would eventually run out. And we figured that would be the same thing with Israel. And at some point, they will revert back to their typical approach, which is pressuring Israel to terminate our operations and allow our enemies to escape from defeat. And we said that the best thing that our enemies could do is that Israel, as soon as our allies, like the US and like many in Europe, would put up a stop sign and say, Israel, stop, that we blow right through that stop sign. And we're doing that right now. This war has been going on for 5 months. Many countries, and certainly the UN, has been telling us to stop. To a large extent, Biden has all but said, stop. We're definitely getting that message. And Israel's blowing right through that. That is a certain level of sovereignty, independence that Israel needs. I think we've already gotten that from the morality of the UN. No international body can tell Israel, and I think all Israelis feel this, that the UN, the Red Cross, the women's organizations that did not support our women when they were attacked, we know our morality. We don't need to get lectured by anybody else on morality. And I think the same thing when it comes to how we are executing this war. Secretary Blinken had mentioned once or twice that was only through U.S. efforts that restrained Israel and forced Israel to, start caring a little bit more about civilians' lives. That is absolutely BS. That is absolutely not true. We always did that, and the chutzpah of Secretary Blinken to say that is something that has most ID officials have not forgotten, will not forget, and I think this the chutzpah that we have gotten from some of our allies has given Israel a little bit of a spine. And I think that is something that we need. We wish that we could have generated that without October 7th, but now that it's here, we have to make sure that we don't squander it.
U.S. aid to Israel. Is there a concern that that could be delayed, restricted, not approved if the relationship is more damaged? And what's the current status of the aid package?
It is a concern. There's, without going into details that I really don't know for sure, but some of the activities of the IDF has been to limit and to save some of our weapons for potential use up north, with the recognition that some of our aid may be delayed. And that's something that the IDF now has to take into account. I'm not saying that stuff has been stopped, but certainly amongst Democrats, and Democrats do control the Senate right now, even if the Biden administration wants to keep sending aid to Israel, despite the public, jabbing with the prime minister, I do believe that the administration does not want Israel to be badly hurt. I think the administration wants to continue to allow much of the aid, if not all of the aid, to flow to Israel, and only holding back aid at a little bit at certain times to create a certain pressure dynamic. The Senate and the Democratic Senate, it's a different story. And that is, something that had moved down the sideline. It started with Bernie Sanders a number of years ago, and it's moved now to a group. It's beyond the squad in the Senate. There's about a dozen, or at least 10 or 11 members of the Senate who are now pretty consistently calling for restraints. They already passed a law that says that all aid, there has to be a sort of confirmation that whoever receives aid is following U.S. Practices when it comes to warfare. Obviously, that's something that Israel does, but putting it there was very clearly meant as a threat to Israel. And frankly, these laws are always meant to be applied whenever they want. So in the same way that you'll have a speed limit that's relatively low. It's at any point that the police can sort of pull someone over. The same thing here. They put in a bar that they would be able to use to potentially restrain and restrict Israeli actions, or at the very least, try to haul some Israeli officials before the Senate, to grill them publicly, to try to humiliate them. That's all part of the problem, which always goes towards the delegitimization and the confirmation by something wrong, and Israel needs to be restrained.
In terms of Hezbollah, the U.S. outwardly has expressed its agreement with Israel, the need to destroy Hamas, and now there's just this big debate about how to make that happen. Is the U.S. in agreement with Israel about the threat of Hezbollah? Will there be an issue with U.S. support if war were to break out in the north?
I think at a core level, I think there is a genuine appreciation of the danger of what Hezbollah represents. However, one of the core approaches of this administration, which is very similar to the Obama administration, and it needs to be said, not that different from the Trump administration, has been to avoid war at almost all costs. One of the primary differences is that the Biden administration, Obama administration, have been very comfortable with trying to pay off our allies, which, in the case of Iran, has only led Iran to spend more money on their proxies, which has added more fuel to the fire, using that previous metaphor. But I think it is fair to say that when we look at Hezbollah and the threat that Hezbollah presents, I think we both see them fairly similarly. I think the approach to Hezbollah is quite different. And that's where I think that there will be an issue. Certainly, the Biden administration wants to avoid at all costs, and I I think that needs to be underlined and bolded at all costs. They do not want to see a bigger war in the Middle East as they get closer and closer to the election. Trust me, Iran knows that. Hezbollah knows that. They will likely be trying to escalate things. But frankly, even from our perspective, the situation up north is not tolerable. Since October 7th, as I know it's been said many times here, it is now no longer acceptable to have Hezbollah with that arsenal that close to our doorsteps. And we have close to about 100,000 residents who are not living at home and cannot go back home until things change. So something's going to need to change. And unless Hezbollah is going to back up and surrender, which I don't anticipate that's going to happen, there probably will be an escalation before November.
Eli, thank you so much for joining this briefing and sharing all of this. I'll ask one final question. Yesterday, former Ambassador Eli Yerushalmi was on our briefing, and he likened the orientation of the West and the U.S. right now to the Middle East and to Israel like the eve of Pearl Harbor, wherein the U.S. did not fully appreciate how imminent the threat was to them. And I'm curious to know if you agree with that assessment, that the U.S. is watching and analyzing, but not necessarily understanding the depth of risk that could come to U.S. soil or U.S. interests.
I think that's a fair assessment. What's interesting is that in Europe, it might be slightly different. Europe has accepted, has welcomed, there's probably a better word for that, but has accepted a significant amount of Muslim refugees over the years, primarily from the Syrian war. And it's created tension that, combined with most Europeans having, not having children, these that are now having significant, if not a plurality. One of the things that came to a head October 8th, all of the pro-Hamas rallies that were in all major cities. It wasn't just like in the US where it was in college campuses. There it was in all major cities, pro-Hamas rallies, and it became quite, the barbarians are within their gates. And this was, we're about to have elections, which is a couple months away. And the sense is that in Europe that are much more concerned immigration, they are the ones who are in the stronger. And I think that, frankly, immigration in the U.S. election, there were just reports of some operative was caught. There is an awareness, I think, at a certain level of the major. If Iran is by their action and that stopped, there is an awareness of the threat, but the public in the U.S. has that level of awareness. And
Eli Piepsh, Director of International Affairs for IDSF, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. We will be back with you tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern. Tomorrow we'll have a little bit of a different briefing than usual. I'll be live from the Gaza border, so please make sure to tune in. It should be a very interesting program. And if we're running a few minutes late, bear with us because we're going to be out in the field, so the setup will be a little bit different. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, take care, everyone.